Willkommen
Right,
zur
let's start.
178.
Welcome to the 178th edition of Europe Calling. Briefly had to check. My name is Maximilian Fries. I am the Managing Director of Europe Calling. I would like to extend a very special welcome to today's panelists, who you can see here and who I will introduce in more detail when it's their turn. I'd like to send regards to Grubenzell next to Munich, where I was told that people are looking at us together in a bigger room. Wonderful. Greetings to Grübenzell, next to Munich. Before we start, a few brief introductory remarks. We will mainly be speaking German today, but we have an interpretation into English. We have guests from 36 countries. Should you wish to hear the English interpretation, you can do that by clicking onto the globe functionality at the bottom.
English interpretation, you can find the interpretation function under the little globe in the control panel. So. Und dann ganz wichtig bei Europe Calling ist auch, dass ihr eure Fragen stellen
It's
könnt
also
und die wir
very important that you
bewerten könnt.
ask questions and are able
Wie es heute abläuft, damit ihr wisst, wann ihr die Fragen
to
stellen könnt. Wir fangen mit 3
give a thumbs
Vorträgen
up to other people's questions. We're going to start with the three presentations by Markus Benzmann, Natascha Strobel, and Christopher Bautz, after which we'll have time for your questions. You can see the QR code as well as the link on the right-hand side. Please pose your questions there. There is an English as well as a German room so that we can separate the questions. To do ask your questions there and give other questions a thumb up because with a total of 3,800 registrations, we won't be able to answer all questions, so we'll try to filter out the most popular ones. As always, this webinar is going to be recorded, after which it'll be made available online on YouTube and as a podcast. So do consider that when you pose your questions. Those were the introductory remarks. Without further ado, we will commence. But before that, a few things. I think all of you know why we are here. Over 2 million people have gone to the streets in Germany. Last weekend, there were bigger demonstrations in Austria as well as in other countries. So something is happening. People are coming together from all walks of life, not just in the cities, also in the countryside, where democratic voices struggle more, and all of them are standing up against right-wing extremism. And this might be one of the biggest democratic movements since 1989, since the Peaceful Revolution. And this is also what we're going to talk about today. But we at Europe Calling are going to start a series on the topic of right-wing extremism and the defense of democracy. And we're going to continue with this topic over the next months. We're going to talk about legal avenues, the protection of institutions, injustice. So there's a whole lot to discuss. And in this election year, in 2024, where so many people are going to be voting this year, more so than ever before in our history, it is all the more important. We're not only talking about Europe, USA and India, also two countries worth mentioning in this context. But now to part one, the new right in Europe. I already said it, Markus Benzmann is here, senior reporter at Corrective. He is an expert on the new right, the AfD, and Russian influence, among other things. And he helped uncover the secret meeting in Potsdam. He co-researched it. Markus, I very much look forward to your presentation. You have the floor. Thank you so much that so many of you have decided to join us to discuss the matter. Perhaps I'll briefly introduce Corrective. We are a media house, a not-for-profit media house, founded in 2014, so we're 10 years old now. We're financed by donations and by projects, and because, of course, we are criticized from all angles because of our research. Well, a lot of people ask, who is funding us, but that can be seen on our website. Of course, we are independent. We are a media house because we try to find a reply to the different challenges of the new media world. Nowadays, of course, everyone can be a sender and a receiver. And from the beginning, our idea was, okay, if we're all swimming in this river, and if the journalists have lost the position of gatekeepers, then it would be good if the other swimmers also knew how to deal with journalism, which is why a part of our work is classical research, but we also try to convince people to co-research with us. We also have a partnership with young people where we train them to become journalists. And of course, if everyone can use a mobile phone, potentially everyone could be a journalist, but then it's important to learn the craft. And one of the central theses is the following. Investigative research is a core part of the work in our media house. We do not wait for a leak to be handed to us. We have the principle of open research. We ask a question and then we look into our network, and then a leak is the result, basically, of a start. And then this summer, we got together and we thought about the strategy of the right-wing extremists in Germany and Europe in 2024. And we tried to develop various concepts as to how to approach this. We have been working on the AfD and the New Right since 2016 intensively. There was a donation scandal whereby since 2016, the AfD was, of course, closely tied to Switzerland. We also uncovered the AfD's proximity to Russia in the past. So we had our experience with the AfD as well as a good network of sources within the party. And then there was the pointer that invitations had been sent out to this event, and that, of course, electrified us. Of course, there was once again that sentence that Germany's about to fall and that it's now the last opportunity to save it. 5,000 euros was a donation to take part in this meeting in this Adlon Hotel close to Potsdam. And Gernot Möhrig signed this invitation, an extremist dentist that is a part of this network since the 70s and the 80s. And then, of course, Liman, who was known as an entrepreneur. He founded Backwerk and then also Hans and Glück. It was interesting. It was once again a billionaire from the food industry who was financing the right-wing extremists. And then, of course, we first took a look at the location, and then we thought, okay, this is an event we need to take a closer look at. We were then also successful in getting a copy of a second letter, of a second invitation, where Mr. Sellner was immediately introduced and he was invited to invite the master plan. Mr. Sellner had just published his book where it was clear what he wanted. The central topic of all right-wing extremists is remigration. And Möhring and Mr. Sellner, well, Mr. Möhring since the 70s, they're driven by the idea of a mono-ethnic state. With other words, a population with only one race where immigration isn't accepted. That would mean for the Federal Republic that one wants to turn back time since the 60s, basically. So all of this took place in a hotel, and then we were able to get a colleague in there during the day, undercover, so to speak, who was able to film the people with a small camera. We took a look at the hotel in advance. It was quite interesting. There was a sauna boat hiring company next to us, which was ideal because it took place in November. It sort of had an open window whereby in the evening you could drive back and forth in front of this hotel on this ship, thus allowing you to see the participants of the meeting. And thanks to our sources, we were able to find out what was discussed, and it became clear that the discussions are pretty wild. Our sources have confirmed that Mr. Möhrig set the scene right from the onset by saying, "We, the right, argue about Corona, about Russia, about Israel, or about Ukraine, but all of that is irrelevant. The central and most important topic that unites us is remigration." And then the discussion started. What about the German citizens, which are impossible to get rid of? And then Mr. Sellner, in his presentation, said, no, no, all of that is possible. He divided the people he wanted to get rid of. He said the refugees immediately, those with leave to remain, well, that would take a bit longer. But even the German citizens, which he called non-assimilated citizens, a terrible term, because it opens the gate to hell. Because then, of course, you'd have to define who is non-assimilated. You have to examine and then draw the consequence. And he said this is possible too. And then he mentioned a decade-long project and suggested tailor-made laws as well as adjustment pressure. And in the course of this discussion, it was immediately said, well, one could also found an expert commission that organizes this process according to different viewpoints. And then Mr. Sellner said, well, it is always said that it is a logistic issue to get rid of millions, but it isn't. And then there was this idea of the state in Africa. And then the question was, well, how will one convince Germans that it's a good idea to deport Germans from Germany? And then one decided that via influencers, via the delegitimization of the elections, that via these avenues, this could be possible, that the people would then be willing to support this. And then this term, ethnic election analysis, was also discussed, whereby it was said that, well, the aim, of course, was to delegitimize the election process. So then there was a thesis, and then all of the presentations were held, focusing on how to implement this project. And the AfD was well presented. They had a member of the Bundestag there. They had a party member from Saxony too, who wanted to make his state as a pioneer state for deportations. And he wanted 1.3 million for this. And then there was Roland Hartwig, who was the right-hand man of Mrs. Weidel. In every party, there are people at the front and who sit in every interview, who give speeches. And then there's the organizer, the one who organizes in the background. And he is part of those people of the second row. He comes from the Regional Association of North Rhine-Westphalia. He was a manager at Bayer, was once also a member of the Bundestag, and for long he was considered moderate because he looks pretty sober. But back then, when there was a discussion about Kalvitz, whether you throw him out or not, he separated from people because he was sympathetic towards him. So clearly, he always had a brown spirit. So he was there too. And he also presented an influencer project. And the goal was, well, of course, within this influencer project to implement this main thesis. And the AfD is filled with right-wing extremists. You know Höcke, you know his statements, and Maximilian Krah as well, the so-called Spitzencandidate for the European elections. He wrote a book, Politics from the Right, where he argues that it's difficult to deal with all of the citizens with a migration background, and that he says that it is possible to expel them against their will over the next 10 years, thereby already suggesting a number of years. So this is a topic that is discussed in the AfD, and Mr. Sellner managed to have remigration replace the term deportation in the AfD. So when one speaks about refugee streams via the Mediterranean or the Balkan route, the question is always, how do you deal with the people that do not have the leave to remain? And the word deportation is normally used. But remigration is to replace deportation. And with remigration, one says, well, it is a change of reality going far further back by stating that what happened in the 60s, where millions of people came over here as guest workers, that is something they didn't want to accept. They see the state as a mono-ethnic state. And with Roland Hartwig, there was someone here who says, okay, I'm speaking on behalf of the executive committee. I'm going to propose this project. And that was, of course, not in line with the public statements whereby the AfD doesn't have citizens of first or second or third class. But at this event, it really seemed like everyone's on the same boat, and that Mr. Sellner's idea will now be taken over, as well as his dream of a mono-ethnic state. And of course, we examined research, and it was clear to me that this would be subject to quite a lot of attention. But when the story was published, this triggered an avalanche with which, well, which I hadn't expected. It was almost like all of a sudden the masks were torn off the people's faces when all of a sudden knew that the AfD isn't a party against heat pumps, but a party of Russia and a party of deportations. And Mr. Carr writes in the same book that he would like to see Germany next to China and Russia in a multipolar world order, and the consequence would be that the universal human rights would no longer be valid. And this also makes sense. If there are no universal human rights, then one can also think about deporting millions of people. And this story, in my opinion, all of a sudden showed that voting for the AfD has a consequence on all of us. If the right-hand man of Weidel makes such statements, it is clear that this affects everyone. And of course, there's a lot of excitement now. People saying we spoke of deportations, but there was a sort of legalist atmosphere with the goal of getting the people out of the country, first with money, then with tailor-made laws, and then with adjustment pressure. So you might imagine what the further consequence would be. And this, of course, then led to many people protesting. And the AfD is, of course, criticizing, corrective to say the least. We're bombarded with hate mails and phone calls. The AfD said we must be reprimanded. One of our colleagues, John Peters, was kind of focused on, and he was accused and falsely represented as a left-wing extremist. And of course, the way they dealt with this response also confirms the research. It is clear that the AfD is willing to implement what it intends to as soon as it gains power.
Thank you very much indeed. It was a very important introduction to the topic, and I would like it to take up the top question to you from Slido. It's not a question, it's 81 persons have voted it up. I would like to express my great respect for your research. You did a wonderful piece of work, which does a lot of good to our country. Thank you very much. So much acknowledgement for what you have achieved with your research. Let's carry on. We will now move on to Natascha Strobel. Whoever looks at this topic will meet Natascha Strobel. She'll come along at some stage. She's one of the most intelligent experts on the new right, on fascism, and the extremist ultra-right movements. She's the author of many publications, and I'm really very grateful and excited that she's here tonight, although, of course, there's hardly anything positive to be found in the subject matter itself. Thank you very much. I'm really very happy to see the great interest in this topic, and I don't want to lose too much time. To be honest, I would just like to take perhaps a bird's view of the situation and the constitution of the new right. The new right, very briefly, I don't want to delve into the history of it too much. It really goes back to the 50s and the 60s of the past century, and it goes back to France. The basic idea was that with elections on its own, you cannot change a society. You really need, according to Antonio Gramsci, a pre-political activity, because that's the area where society is negotiated. And that's when people started moving away from the election campaigns, and the idea of think tanks came up, and the discussion clubs. So of course, we need to protect Antonio Gramsci. His hegemonic theories are very interesting, and he did not forget the socio-economic dimension of it at all. This is being diluted nowadays, but we simply have to be clear about the terms and the development, the roots of this whole movement. It all passed through a very difficult history, and we will take a jump forward into the 2000s years, that decade. Very early on, online media came up, and they became quite fashionable. Why? Because the new right wasn't really well presented or well represented in the classical media. And that's why they adopted the social media very early on. It's an activist new right that suddenly developed. In the past, they used to be rather more discussion oriented, and they publicized their views. Elderly people defended those views of the new right. But then the identitarian movement came up also in France, and in the 2000s, around that time, a lot of young people came along, and the Casa Pound was decisive for that. And it was a neo fascist, very active movement in Italy. And during those 2000 years, the new right developed as we know it today. And I think it's important to be aware of that historic development. Obviously, the social media changed everything, also the media presence, but it also changed the extreme right-wing movement. It really led to a dogmatizing of that right-wing extremism, which is very pragmatic nowadays. The change that came about in the past 20 years moved from a focus on real dogma. Let's think of South Tyrol, for example, which is really very important for the German-speaking political scenario. And a change really came along. They really focused on those topics which can be emotionalized and which can be spread and reach out very far. What we now see, the latest trend, is a transnationalization. So countries and national borders are of no importance any longer because the topics are really becoming more and more uniform, and it's spread across the borders. The topics are the same, basically, in the United States and in Europe. And it's not a one-way road. We don't simply take on and learn from the United States. It's also going backwards from Europe towards the United States. And many of the issues have nothing to do with reality. There are a lot of debates going on, which we have in different regions and geographies. And the cultural fight really takes those topics on the LGBTQ community and others to a transnational level. So we should no longer consider the new right as linked only to the national borders or the national context. They are really transnational now. And looking forward into the future, just have a look at what's happening in the United States now, what the debate is all about, then that will come to Europe in the next 3 months. And looking at what's being discussed in Hungary today, that will become relevant in a few months in the United States. So it's a very pragmatic cultural fight going on. It's not so dogmatic as in the past. It's much more open, and it allows other political powers to come along and to associate themselves with it. And that's why we see more and more a mixture of what the extreme right-wing movement is. Even the fascist movement, and it melts into conservatism. They don't really cannot be taken one for one, but they do share a lot of strategies, a lot of ideology, and many topics. So some of the alignment means that we have a huge surge of conservatism. Germany is perhaps not quite there yet. the defenses are going down in countries like Hungary, in Austria under Sebastian Kurz, and the Tories under Boris Johnson. Those times really signaled a move towards more of a conservative mode of thinking and tendency in politics. And that's also the basis, the floor for the remigration idea. So that's not only just a fashionable idea of Mr. Sellner. Of course, he wants to sell his books and sell them well, but it is not only to be seen as a topic of the AfD. It will also be a topic that shall be introduced in the international right-wing extremist movement. We will surely see that topic is coming up in the United States. And my thesis is that it'll also become more and more important for the election campaign in the United States. Of course, the civil rights debate is still to be had in the United States, but yet still, the focus on the extreme right-wing movement in one country is no longer sufficient because we are faced with a transnational, almost a global movement, and the instrument is the cultural fight. Gender diversity, anti-racism, that sort of thing. And I think the next topic will be the climate crisis, and it is also already being instrumentalized in this debate for those who simply negate it. But I think, I assume it'll be the climate crisis will become one of the big fights in the near future, and perhaps it'll be a good fight to be had. It'll help the extreme right-wing movement to argue that those immigrants need to be kept out, and asylum and climate crisis can be linked up with each other by simply saying there's not enough for everyone, and some will die because there will be not enough resources for everyone. But those who have to survive, that will have to be Europe, that'll have to be the Occident, that'll have to be the white race. I think that'll be the next big topic of the extremist right-wing movement. There's a lot of violence behind it in reality, and I think that saying that fascism is always something that simply goes beyond any borders, because it justifies violence. For example, fascism really is the only political ideology that justifies violence without any ethical or legal borders. It's just violence. And if you talk about fascism, and I would do it in this context, then there is a fascist project coming along, and it'll be hugely violent, and it'll not be just an intellectual project, that there will be real consequences also on the basis of the debate on remigration, and a fanatic ideologist will always claim that even violent instruments may be used to clear out the society and the nation. And it will certainly be selective of who belongs to the race or the ethnic or group and who doesn't. But there are also people who are socially regarded as not fit for living in our society, like, for example, people living in the streets, people without work, and other people. If you look at the manifestos of those political groups, you will find that they already have a focus on these groups. During the meeting that Corrective reported on, they said, well, those people can simply be returned to Africa and go elsewhere. I don't think that they're ready to say it quite so openly yet. But the idea, of course, is that this will be an ongoing fight, and we should all be prepared really to defend those who will be the first victims or targets, and defend ourselves also, because you really need to reflect on which are the factors that will qualify or disqualify you yourself. So looking at the society itself in that way is in the final analysis a fascist approach, and fascism also calls for an immediate reaction. And then the second question is, what is it that you can to do? And perhaps we have an opportunity here to discuss about that, because we shouldn't move forward in a headless fashion, but it is a very serious concern and it needs attention and has earned that sort of attention, unfortunately. Thank you very much.
Ja, bewusst eine Pause gelassen. Ich glaube, die braucht es da. Vielen Dank. Das war, ja,
Thank you very much.
viel gelernt, viel verstanden.
I think
Mal die
we
Wichtigkeit
learned a lot.
auch ganz klar gemacht.
Thanks again for stressing how important the matter is.
Dann gebe ich jetzt weiter an Christoph.
Without further ado, I'll give the floor to Christoph Bautz.
Bei Europe Calling as
Christoph joined us a few times now at Europe
kennt viele
Calling.
Deutschland und auch darüber hinaus sehr, sehr groß.
He
Habt jetzt auf vielen
comes from the Citizens Movement Compact. He spoke at many demonstrations and co-organized them. Many know him from these. Christoph, if I may say so, I like what you do at a local level, that you go into the constituencies, also in Eastern Germany, to really actively get engaged in favor of democratic movements. I'm sure you'll say a few words about that. But what you do is really applied democracy. So thank you very much for this. Now you have the floor, and thanks again for being here. A very good evening. I also found these presentations very impressive. It is interesting and impressive to see how well organized our opponents are, and that it can quickly make you unconscious. And I think that that was also the feeling a lot of people had over the last weeks and months. People also that took to the streets had kind of a feeling of being unconscious, and then a momentum, a dynamic is required, and the corrective research provided this dynamic. The research once again showed how massive the developments or the effects would be of what the new right is planning here. You said that the mask was torn off people's faces, and I also felt Like people now understood what these people are planning. It became tangible. People realized that people I know would be affected. And over the last years, we've seen other social protest movements, Fukushima, for example. Here too, many people were all of a sudden scared. What if this radioactive cloud reaches us? And then all of a sudden, there was a moment of organization, and within a few weeks, hundreds of thousands took to the street to say, okay, this must change, and this opened a moment or a window of opportunity, and then the nuclear power plants were closed down. Or then there were the big protests against the extraction of coal. And here too, this kind of made climate change tangible. People realized, okay, this is a conflict about coal, and all of a sudden, 50,000 people took to the streets. And this led to a phasing out of coal and nuclear energy. We saw a turnaround in politics, and I feel like this is a similarly historic moment. People that had never thought about joining a demonstration all of a sudden took to the streets. And within a few days, all of a sudden, there is this movement that is created. A whole lot of grassroots movements, a lot of it organized at the local level, and especially organization work in the eastern part of the Republic. And it was important that hundreds of thousands of people also took to the streets in the cities. But what was even more exciting was that in rural areas, people too took to the streets to demonstrate. In areas where people appeared fearful to even utter their opinion. And now it seems like there's a new dynamic of people once again taking to the streets and feeling empowered to utter their opinion. Now, of course, this research work was decisive in triggering this process. And what resulted were these 1.5 million people that were on the streets on one day. Last weekend, there were protests in a total of 321 locations, which is really a first timer. There was a Friday for Futures protest that was announced, and then all of a sudden 25,000 people were on the Paris Square. And once again, all of a sudden, there was this dynamic. Friday for Futures who said, we will only be able to solve the climate crisis in a democracy. And on the other hand, the climate crisis endangers everything we fought for to be a democracy. So it became clear to Friday for Futures that there must also be a democracy defense movement. And all of a sudden, this led to a certain dynamic. 130,000 people in Hamburg that took to the streets. The protest was packed, to say the least. And all of a sudden, many realized, wow, something huge is being created here. If this spills over to Munich or to Berlin in a couple of days, then I want to join in. And then 300,000 people took to the streets in Munich and 350,000 in Berlin. The big protests in all of the major towns and cities. And then last weekend, the choreography continued all over Germany with the 321 locations. And then all of a sudden there were protests in Zwickau and Bautzen, in Chemnitz and Pirna. So many locations in the east of our republic, which were primarily known for the right-wing movements to enjoy a hegemony. And now all of a sudden, people feel once again empowered to utter other opinions. I am repeatedly asked, where did all of this come from? And I felt like there was kind of a core of civil activists. And with Fridays for Future, we, of course, had a partner with Agile Networks. So they co-triggered this, and we at Campact were also able to mobilize people to these demonstrations. The teams were on the phone day and night to encourage people to really do something, participate in a demonstration. We need this. And we also received all kinds of donations supporting us. 150,000 euros that we sent to Berlin and Munich in order to have the right technology at these demonstrations to ensure that everyone understands what is being said. Or there were also a few thousand euros that we dispersed into different locations in Germany to ensure that people could become active. Now, next Saturday, there will be the next step of this choreography in Berlin, where we said, okay, now again, all of us together, side by side, to really show that we can only be successful against the AfD if everyone comes together, including the democratic parties, and if they take this way more seriously than hitherto. I think all of us need to, of course, now also discuss about a prohibition of right-wing extremist structures. We have to ensure that there's a prohibition of the AfD in those countries where they have an anti-institutional way of going about. This includes Saxony-Anhalt, Saxony and Thuringia. We had a petition of 1.7 million people to, the largest petition ever in this country, a petition against Björn Höcke. And then, of course, the demand was a forfeiture of his fundamental rights, according to the article in the Basic Law, Article 18. Of course, this is contentious because if you do not, if you aren't successful with such an appeal, this strengthens the AfD, so it is quite complicated. It is more clear when it comes to these individual states. Now, Natascha already expressed how the narratives of the new right are often also now being used by conservatives. We hear this when, for example, Merz speaks of social tourism from the Ukraine or other things. And these are attempts to use the narratives of the right to benefit yourself, which of course isn't necessarily successful, but it means that it leads to a normalization. So the CDU now needs to be forced to clearly say no cooperation with the AfD. As well as no normalization of narratives. And another thing we're going to do on Saturday is that the coalition government needs to do more. It needs to speak about bans, prohibitions, but it must also discuss how democracy can continue to convince people. Of course, the coalition government is constantly arguing. Its performance is close to a catastrophe, with austerity policies at the cost of social cohesion. So that too is something we need to work on. Scholz promised leadership in his party campaign. He now must deliver a different performance because in its current state, it is really driving people towards the AfD. It is certainly the best campaign program you could imagine for them. It'll be interesting to see whether this movement yields success or whether it's something that arises and disappears fairly quickly again. But my gut feeling is that something successful is being created here. Max, you said it in your introductory remarks. But it is important to focus on structures that offer support into the right direction. Last weekend on Sunday in Thuringia, there were local elections, and internally we assumed that we wouldn't be successful. The CDU candidate was right wing. All of them stood by his side, nevertheless. At the end, the AfD lost. They lost with 47.5%, which is of course too much, but this wouldn't have happened without this movement at a local level, because many people that joined or decided to vote the AfD aren't necessarily right-wing extremists, and perhaps are now seeing how dangerous the AfD is, which is why in Ollerkreis the people perhaps didn't all vote the AfD, and which might also be the reason why the AfD, according to the latest surveys, is losing grounds. We call these people the so-called switchers. And of course, with the recent events, the switchers are once again seemingly switching. And then in Thuringia, in Saxony-Anhalt, and in Saxony, things are increasingly dangerous. I think it is clear. If there's a second situation with Kimmrich, and there's once again this sort of cooperation, then I think we will quickly see a similar movement taken to the streets, and that gives us hope. And it also gives us hope to see that this protest also spilled over to Austria, that 80,000 people took to the streets in Vienna as well, where, of course, a lot is at stake with an FPO that has up to 32% according to surveys. So that too is extremely helpful. Allow me to say one last thing. I know that time is running out, but perhaps I could say one more thing about the further strategy. And the 9th of June is central for this. Of course, the AfD wants to gain grounds, but nevertheless, elections are important for them. And on the 9th of June, we will have local elections in 9 states, and we have the European elections too. And the right, of course, wants to come together at a European level too. We just heard this. They want to cooperate in the European Parliament together with the Conservatives, a kind of Weber-Meloni pact. And everything that was achieved over the last years is to be gotten rid of, such as the Green Deal. And now everyone that is a Democrat must go vote. Whoever isn't convinced that this election is important needs to be convinced. We need a participation above 60%. We need to also reach the switchers who reject Björn Höcke and say, I don't want him, but who still vote the AfD because they want to express their protest. And then, of course, first voters. The voting age was reduced. So we have 7 years of young people that will go vote for the first time. And in Bavaria and Hesse, during the last elections, the AfD was extremely successful via Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And now it is clear that this cannot happen again. We also need to gain grounds here. So we need to ensure that this election becomes something central. We're currently preparing a very far-reaching societal alliance that will once again take to the streets on the 8th of June in order to tell everyone, go vote tomorrow and vote Democratic parties. And there's going to be all kinds of personalities and artists that will come on stage in order to express that important message. Don't vote for the AfD. Go vote for another Europe. Of course, you need to somehow describe what this different Europe might look like, but this in itself might lead to better results. Of course, the AfD wants a bottom-up approach, first at a local level, then at a state level, and then at a federal level. And they do believe that things will carry on this way. But I do think we have the possibility here to ensure that this doesn't come about. I think we can do what we need to ensure that they won't reach the 20%, but a lot less in the elections, and that they yield poor results than they want. This is an opportunity, and we must seize it now.
Ja, vielen Dank dir.
Thank you very much that you've already turned the perspective to the future. There are so many questions, I haven't counted them. Endless questions have come in, and we will, of course, be taking them up perhaps in other future webinars. We'll be looking at legal questions and take on other perspectives. So don't despair, they won't be lost, your questions. They will be answered in the next webinars. We still have a bit more than half an hour, and perhaps we could perhaps have a closer look at some of the topics that you've already mentioned. You've mentioned the conservative parties. What is the role of those conservative parties? When the demonstrations are going on, they call for a demasking of the extreme right, and don't call it conservative, because there are democratic conservative parties. Markus, there were people with CDU connections. So perhaps you could enlighten us on who was there from the Conservative Party. Natasha wrote a whole book about conservatism, and she could probably report on that for something like 5 hours. But perhaps we can identify it a little better whether some conservative parties have made it, and how did they make it? Like in Poland, for example, can they be part of the alliance? And I would like to give back the question on the alliances. How does it work with the CDU and CSU in Bavaria and with other conservative parties? So I think you understood what I mean. Markus. Yes. At that meeting, there were also some representatives of the value union, the Werteunion, but they are about to found their own party, and Mr. Maaßen would probably be the leader, and then an extreme rightist, a dentist, would probably join him and his new party, and we'll probably have to have a solid research into that new makeup. But I would like to warn you. Don't step into the trap. And because Scholz also wants to deport, and Merz said they're all little pashas and they also want to deport them. So they're all one of a kind. So we need to differentiate. We really need to be very, very careful and not fall into that trap. And let's have a closer look at how they go about the right to asylum, for example. But there is Mr. Laschet, Mr. Wüst, and even Mr. Söder. They will not question that people will be confronted with these, with the remigration move. And I think we've already heard about this theory of purity, and I really dislike that thoroughly. And I think we really need to make sure that we enter into the debate proactively. We want to approach things differently. So let's not get on the bandwagon of those extremist right-wing people. It is really fascinating. It's exciting because we published our report 3 weeks ago, but we are really being attacked. But Alice Weidel and Mr. Kopala are not stepping up to a microphone and tell people what they really want to do, because those following the followers of Höcke and Kars have already determined what they want to reach as a long-term objective. And I think that the CDU really needs to identify its own firewall. And I think I would appeal to everyone to watch out very, very closely, because some people call for getting rid of the Nazis, but what happens if that's the majority? It's as if they wanted to win the Second World War once more and win with their racist ideas. Natascha. I really agree that you need to be very clear and very careful with the terminology that you use. I'm not a fan of calling everyone a Nazi, and I am not a fan of saying that everyone is a right-wing populist. You hear that everywhere, and everybody or every right-wing party is tagged with that. So I think we really need to have a much closer look. It's perhaps a professional disease of mine that I like to talk about definitions and have a clear idea of the terminology. That's why I talked about the radicalized conservatism, because it's not the racial right-wing extremism and not something else either. At the same time, it is important to realize that historic moments can come up where those streams and those trends meet. But fascism is not only Germany 1940, it's also Franco, it's also Horthy, it's also the Austrian fascism, it's also the Danish fascist party, the Finn-Swedish fascist movement, and so on. So you can clearly see how this is a spring of the old fascism. But it is important to really clearly differentiate. And it didn't come from nothing. It's not because the people are evil and they suddenly decide to turn that way. No, it's certainly also born from a certain void, because people no longer knew what conservative the 20th century. It's not one of the typical subjects that they deal with. The climate change, for example, although nature preservation was a conservative topic at a time, it's not only racism. A cultural fight is something to overcome everything else. It's very emotional. It's really victimizing certain groups, and it can happen to every group. Really, it's attacking the equality of the sexes, for example, which would move us back decades ago. Do women really have the same value as men? Of course they do. And also, women enjoy finally moving closer to equality. So that is something important in the cultural fight. Then we have all the queer topics, all those people who are different, but also the heat pump, for example. How can you possibly make something boring as the heat pump to a cultural fight instrument? So I don't think we should really go for that. And that is where I would really think that the conservative parties need to be held responsible if they take on board that kind of fight, because they reflect a society which is really not democratic any longer, which is very authoritarian. Even if they don't want to join them until the final end, because that would perhaps be too much for them. But the democratic powers really need to be pressurized and have enough self-esteem to decide or to opt rather for the democracy and not for 2 or 3% more. Thanks very much. Before I pass the floor to Christoph, you talked about equality topics, the ban on abortion, for example, in the US, really gave an uplift to certain parties. Then we had the election campaign for Tusk in Poland, and we had a female panelist who said that the protection of women and equality rights was really an extremely important topic. The self-determination of women, for example, mobilized a lot of voters. And I think it'll be very fascinating to look at these topics. It's also very topical in Spain, for example, because equality came under attack, and it can suddenly become instrumental for getting the dynamic of a counter movement going. That's why I picked up this topic, but now I pass the floor to Christoph. Thanks. I think if you look at the protests, at the demonstrations, then I think it's of crucial importance to remain as open as possible so that people who would traditionally vote for the CDU and the CSU, but also for the left party in Germany, they should all feel welcome, and they should all feel that this is the kind of movement that they want to join. And in Berlin, for example, you had all sorts of speeches being held from the rostrum. People were shouting, the whole city of Berlin is against the AfD, and half of the people joined in the chorus of people shouting that, and half of the people, the protesters, were a little puzzled. But still, it is good to have a broad demonstration movement going. And it's also positive if Mr. Merz knows that his party supporters will also be out in the streets demonstrating. And that's a very important dynamic to actually reach those core voters of those parties, of all those parties in reality. I think that's something that we should try to achieve. That would be very important. At the same time, having representatives of the CDU present in demonstrations and also speak up openly to criticize those narratives is equally important, because the radicalized conservatism has its own narrative. So it'll be a bit of a conundrum, really, to involve those conservative parties and also make sure that they draw a clear line towards an even righter or more extreme movement. That needs to be brought into a certain balance. And also, I think we can learn from other countries, from their successes. What did the Spaniards do to get the right movement going and the right results? What did the Polish population do to achieve the success? Of course, the right also made its mistakes, and the abortion regulation really provoked many women to demonstrate. Alice Weidel brought up the idea of a Dexit. That is something that can motivate you to vote them, but it can also put you completely off, and that's something we saw with the Brexit in the UK. So I think strategically speaking, it's important to look at the excesses in the movement, but also to look at the successes and perhaps at the defeats, because Milei in South America did not work out well. I think that's exactly the idea of our series of webinars on this topic. We will probably have another webinar in March on economic inequality, with fears of losing out completely, the unequal opportunities for rising up in society. I think that really is a very important topic in itself. We still have a quarter of an hour. We talked about conservatism, and now we have another topic that was voted up. Anja Prosecco raised the question. I really wonder what we can do against all the very successful disinformation campaigns from Russia and from other sources. What can we do as a civil society? So disinformation, also from Russia, how can we defend ourselves? What is the role of Russia in actual fact? Natasha has already mentioned it a little bit, but I think Markus is also very knowledgeable about that. And that's why I would like to do the round once again. And perhaps Markus could say something about the role of Russia. I think I said it in my introduction. The AFD, over 10 years, when Lucke was still in the European Parliament, they had an eternity rule for being associated with the West. And this is no longer applicable. Mr. Khan really wants a success for Russia in Ukraine, because then Eurasia could also be integrated into Europe, and they would have more friends than foes. I would say in that context, if something is worth a cultural fight, it would be the question, where do you want to live, in Miami or in Siberia? If you really spell out to the people what the policy of the AFD means, what the consequence of that policy would be, it would be Europe under Russian dominance, and that would be the price for a vote for the AFD. That's closely connected. Their deportation fantasies can, of course, only be implemented in a Europe where Russia will be a partner and not Western democracies. And I think that is the main issue that needs to be taken up. The CDU is the party of the Western Alliance. And And if you say to an AFD supporter that he's against the immigrants, but if you tell them then in the next round that it means that you opt for Russia, then perhaps they will reconsider their options. And I think that's also a question for a discussion to be had. I think nobody really wants to live in Siberia. Natascha, in Austria, where your foreign minister danced with Putin, the former foreign minister danced with Putin. Okay, so some link was there. I think that's also very exciting. Perhaps there are some differences qualitative. We can't hear you. I'm sorry. Now, Austria and Russia is a topic in itself. We do have two Russians that are being heard in the legal proceedings against the former Chancellor Sebastian Kurz, which is a topic all in itself, to be honest. But the question of Russia, well, of course, we have more than one tendency in the right-wing extremism. We have the traditionalists, those who claim that they want a traditional society with a traditional family, with father, mother, and children. And there are the decadent societies where you have a fusion of the sexes and you let your colored hair fly whichever way it wants to, so on and so forth. So it's very diverse. But it's also Julius Evola was the theoretician of the Italian fascism, and that's really a meeting point for Trump and Putin because they're all into the cultural fight themselves. And it's all a question of money also. And it's interesting to have a closer look at it. Disinformation was not invented by the right-wing extremism. It was invented by think tanks of economics. The first campaign of disinformation came up in the 70s when the smoking legislation was strengthened. Philip Morris, the Koch brothers, really had all the universities and the think tanks behind them, and they all agreed with one another and spread disinformation. They even had studies at hand explaining to the general public that smoking was healthy. This sounds rather crazy nowadays, but it was that kind of disinformation that was utilized in cultural fights because sometimes the motivator is an economic interest group. And it's important to be aware of that because it's very important at the level of grassroots to look at the consequences and the effect. So the cultural fights need to be analyzed as to the interests behind them. And then I would like to say something more generally. What helps against the cultural fight? They should not become the guiding principle of politics. You don't have to be led by them or orient what you want to offer and discuss by the cultural fight. Let's put the question to the people: how do you wish to live? Where would you like to live? What does a successful life look like? Very few people would say, well, a happy life is a life where the majority of the foreigners are deported. No, people will simply say they will want peace and quiet. They don't want to be overburdened with payment orders, and it's the small dreams. They want to have their children and be able to raise them well. But the cultural fight we're witnessing now is simply not compatible with our idea of a happy life. So we should not negotiate it on the level of a cultural fight. We should rather look at what would you like life to be like in 5 years' time? And of course, you need many instruments like a fire extinguisher and other things, of course, but we really need to look at politics and political life differently. For the climate crisis, it simply won't work. It won't work for us either. We can't be forever in competition with one another. That certainly is not the summit of human cultivation or culture. Perhaps we could be more future oriented and say, this is what we would like our life to look like in 5 years. And the right extremists don't have that on offer. I've already put the two links for the webinars in the chat because we also had representatives from Spain there. They had visions for the next 10 years developed, and they were hugely successful with that. They tried to be as transparent as possible and really demonstrate what your local environment would look like. That was extremely successful in Spain. Christoph.
Ja, ich glaube, da will ich auch direkt anknüpfen. Ich glaube, wir müssen echt eine gute Balance finden.
I agree. I think we have to find the right balance
Und auch was Desinformation anbelangt,
to combat disinformation, to create transparency.
wie sehen auch diese rechten Netzwerke aus?
We also need to
Jetzt bei der Europawahl
show what these right networks look like.
wie ist der eigentlich? So, und der ist
Maximilian Krah, for example.
und Björn Höcke wollen viele nicht wählen.
Well, he is like Björn Höcke, and many don't want to vote him.
Sie sagen, ja, das ist ja nicht die AfD. Nein, das ist die AfD.
And then they say, okay, but this isn't the AfD, but it is the AfD, and that needs to be stressed.
Gerade wenn irgendwie Debatten auch hochkommen, mit Fakten zu begegnen, ja.
When there are debates, it's important to present facts. But as Natasha has just said,
Das Spielfeld überlassen, die gesamte öffentliche Debatte prägen zu lassen, sondern selber
we shouldn't allow them
Debatte zu prägen. So, und ich glaube, da
to be the only ones influencing the public debates. We too must trigger debates. And here we need visions as to what can be done.
also wenn wir bestimmte gesellschaftliche Milieus, Sinusmilieus oder so erreichen wollen,
And if we want to reach certain parts of our societies, we need to understand what topics are important to them. For example, when it comes to first-time voters. Well, if you want to convince people to take part in this election, you need to think about what messages will be of importance to them. What are the topics that are of relevance to our voters?
diese Bewegung war so erfolgreich, weil sie so einen Alltagsbezug hergestellt
And this movement was so successful because it created
also nicht sehr theoretische
a certain link to matters that affect us in our daily lives. A concrete example would be the 49 euro train ticket in Germany. This is something concrete that has an effect on people's lives. These are the types of examples we need in order to enthuse people who then say, okay, that is something worth voting for. And I'm sure that we can learn a whole lot from Spain. This is really where we need to become active. And that's also what we're going to do on the 8th of June. We'll speak about a different Europe. We'll also speak about a different society. And of course, we'll warn as to what could come from the right-hand side of the political spectrum. And if we find the right balance here, I do think that we can be successful as a movement. And it is really important for this to become a movement. It is important for people to get engaged. On our email list, we got 700,000 new people over the last few weeks. We now have about 3.5 million people on our email list. And of course, all these people need to be reached. They can go speak to their politicians. They can go to different assembly places in order to reach other people. So it's important to get organized. It's important to have structures for people because this is a huge opportunity. We started this alliance Together Against Riot, and we now have 400 contacts in different locations where people got organized to form an alliance. And that's why it is high time to create empowerment in order to see what the next steps could be. We need to set this up from a grassroots movement that can lead to success, that can lead to a new type of hope, that will ensure that we do not feel unconscious, that we aren't only in the defensive, but actually switch over to becoming offensive. Thank you. You answered a lot of questions also by Claudia and Leonie as to what individual people can do. We have now 2 minutes left, and allow me to pose you one more question. Let's leave ban or prohibition aside because we'll have a whole webinar on this. But Alexander is asking what companies support meetings like the one in Berlin. And this relates to the role of companies. Markus, perhaps you could briefly speak about companies because there was also economic actors there at that meeting. So what was the role of businesses? And then Natasha, perhaps you could have the final word. Perhaps you could tell us about the importance of the industry and businesses with their representatives. Also, when it comes to the new right, what role do these people play also in terms of a strategy against right-wing extremism? Markus, please. The concept of this event was to reach rich people. It was a meeting with participants that were rather wealthy. Not everyone can afford 5,000 euros to take part in a meeting. And that is what is fascinating. From the very beginning, the AfD decided to try to get as much capital as possible. And that was the idea here as well, to get as much money as possible. And we have people from all walks of life, lawyers, entrepreneurs, all kinds of people that were to come together in order to implement this plan with the help of the AfD and the ideologue Sellner. And that's kind of this relation between people with money, ideologues, and implementers. These people came together in this framework. And of course, that's rather scary. And that's perhaps also why people took to the streets. My personal feeling is the following. I think this is something that has come out of the bubble. Society at large is speaking about this now. And that's what's interesting here. And perhaps this movement can help save our democracy, which would, of course, be excellent. Before I give Natasha the floor, I also put it into the chat that Europe Calling is financed or funded by crowdfunding. But of course, without the right-wing extremists, Collective 2, by the way, and Campact 2, we are the smallest, though. There's only me at Europe Calling who actually earns something. All of the others are volunteers. So if you do want to support us, please do so by becoming a supporting member. And now Natascha has the floor. Well, we're happy that we don't have to pay 5,000 euros to be a part of this webinar. Of course, we could speak about the importance of capital at length. But as you said, there's the people providing the funds. We have the ideologues. Those are also the ones I mainly deal with. But the people providing the funds do not do this because they have nothing else to do. These are investments. And of course, when you invest, you want a return. These shifts we've observed since 2008 within the capital, which of course isn't one big block of people that all have the same interests. We have different groups with contradictory interests too. But for many, it is clear that they're struggling. This is, for example, the fossil fuel industry, and that is also why they supported Trump at large. There are groups within the capital that doesn't care much about democracy, but instead cares more about their own business model. And if their business model is endangered, you might also support groups that can guarantee that these business models continue to be successful. Capital also plays a big role in fascism. Of course, we also see that people who struggle with their daily lives might also be convinced to move towards favoring right-wing extremism. But of course, capital itself, as well as the neoliberal form of capitalism, all of that plays a role when it comes to fascism gaining popularity. Of course, this is something we could discuss at length, but when we think about how we want to live together, I think it will be clear that most people do not dream of working for 80 hours. Most people simply want to be secure. And it also isn't the dream to deport people, but rather to live securely. And if we think about what security means, also what social security means, if we think about how we want to live together, how we want to deal with each other, then we can build a future that isn't this neoliberal dystopia nor this authoritarian dystopia. And that is what I would love to talk about, because that's, at the end of the day, what it's all about. How do we want to live? Perfect closing remarks. Nothing to add to this. Thank you very, very much. We had very intensive 90 minutes. A big thank you to our three excellent guests, and also a thank you to the interpreters that did great work in the background. I would like to thank all of you for joining us this evening. We had over 4,000 registrations, one of the biggest webinars we've ever had. And of course, we'll continue. One of the topics mentioned this evening will be subject of further webinars. And if you want to support us, you will find the link in the chat. We have over 1,200 people who are already supporting members. Thank you very much to them. They made this evening possible. A big thank you to all of you, and see you next time at Europe Calling.
Dankeschön. Tschüss.